Welcome back to Beyond Our Voices. We've had a few episodes now and we've spoken about the power of telling your story. We've spoken about some of the emotions that are evoked, and one of those emotions is anger. And anger is an interesting emotion. And are we allowed to feel angry? That's the question we're asking today. And with me is Lynne Hill, who is a counselor. She is an author and she is a rape survivor, a multiple rape survivor. And she joins us here. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Tracy.
So the whole thing we're going to be talking about today is, are we allowed to be angry? Now, the very first time you were raped, you were a young girl. You took a perpetrator to court at the age of 15. You stood in a court of law and you won your case.
Yes.
So it's been a long journey of healing for you. And then it was just a couple of years ago that you lost time in your life and you were gang raped.
Yes.
How are you sitting here feeling today?
I've diffused the anger. I can't say that there are no triggers. I had a trigger just 2 weeks ago, so I diffused a lot of the anger that I felt at 15. In fact, released it totally 23 years later at the age of 38. And then I was okay. And then this happened close to 3 years ago. And so I was up in Johannesburg on a business trip, and obviously I needed to go through the motions again. But I think this time I was a little more equipped from a psychological perspective, but my body rejected the trauma from a physical perspective.
No. I cannot compute the fact that you were raped at 15 and then as a mature woman, it happened to you again, and it takes you right back. I mean, where does it take you? Did it take you back to when you were 15 years old, or is this just completely new trauma? I don't even understand how you begin to deal with something like that.
I don't think I had a choice. It's you just have to, because remember, by 51, I was pretty resolute and committed to my divine purpose, which was to heal and to restore and to inspire. I had transmuted my past pain into authentic power, using purpose as my bridge. And there this happens. So who was I not to accept full responsibility to heal for the second time as a way of not just protecting my sanity, but also protecting my purpose?
But when I sit here listening to your story, I want to tell you that it makes me angry listening to your story. And actually, that's why I specifically asked you to come and talk about this, because I know that you've spent your lifetime working through it. And yet I do feel, even though you've made peace, I do feel that you are angry. And that's okay, we're allowed to be angry, because I think we're taught not to be angry.
Absolutely. I think what has happened from a social scripting is that anger has actually been labeled as a negative emotion. And from where I stand, whatever we label as negative, we either want to conceal because we want to be seen as positive, pushing the positive. So we either conceal it, we will either deny it, and all of that actually leads to repressed anger. So I don't like to label anger as a negative emotion. Every emotion is meaningful. And every emotion has value.
So are we allowed to feel angry? Because I know when I've been through things in my own life, when I was caught in a situation of domestic violence, the one emotion I felt I had to deny myself was anger, because I felt that if I came across as angry, then people were going to blame me. They would say, look at her, she's an angry woman. Look, that's what happened to her. She caused it herself.
Yes.
So I've always felt that anger was the one emotion that I couldn't show.
And I think it is important to understand it as an emotion. We term it as a secondary emotion and not a primary emotion. And that means that anger is a result usually of something else. So anger is produced, whether it is our pain, whether it is threat, whether it is loss, whether it is betrayal, violation, but it is those core things that will generate our anger. Frustration generates our anger. And when you mentioned that you were in that that situation and you did not feel the freedom to feel angry, I ask myself, was it the freedom to feel angry, or was it that you didn't have the freedom to feel fear?
I certainly felt fear. I felt fear, but I felt that I couldn't be angry, but I could be angry at myself. Now, isn't that's easier for us to be angry at ourselves?
In fact, that is one of the reasons that leads to depression, Tracy. So when we do not express our anger, we actually repress it. And repressed anger and unexpressed anger remains unprocessed. And what is unprocessed either then becomes displaced, where it will be lost somewhere.
So give us an example. What would happen?
I bury it for many years. I don't direct it at the individual that has either violated me or abused me or anyone that has wronged me. So I bury it. I own it. I internalize it. I don't know what to do with it but it's there. And then something happens on a day where it is not the same situation, but there is a trigger of a principle where someone disrespects me. So before I was violated, and I've not dealt with that yet. And now someone comes and disrespects me. And it's nothing huge, but that disrespect becomes a trigger for me to actually take that anger that's still sitting somewhere and actually lash out. And most times it is at the wrong person, and most times it is inappropriately. So when you spoke of being in that, in fact, let's go back, that very example was really one of, it was the source of the first rape. That I had to come to terms only after writing a poem 23 years later and reading the poem and taking on an observer status, that I realized, but it was never about me. While you were raping me, you were cursing them, your mother and your sister. And by that time I was a psychology graduate already and realized in that moment, oh my gosh, I was an object of your displaced anger.
Yes, but you're left with a lifetime of dealing with it.
Absolutely.
So how did you, at what point did you know you were angry? Were you angry from the start? Or did anger come along? I mean, because at the time of let's say your rape or any trauma, you're managing other things. You're managing the situation, you're trying to diffuse, then you try and pick up the pieces of your life. So anger comes in later, doesn't it?
I think it kicked in much later. I think as a 15-year-old, what I was left with was a broken soul. Just this absolute brokenness. And remember I said that the anger is a secondary emotion. So it was that hurt and that violation and that infringement of the weirdest degree that I actually had to deal with. And I had to still try to normalize my life because school had to continue. I still had dreams. And, you know, it's only in these moments that I take my hat off to myself as a 15-year-old little girl who refused to give up, who refused to say, because this has happened to me, I'm not going to continue dreaming. In fact, there I made a conscious decision to disempower the rapist and the damage, but to empower my dreams.
And you went to court at the age of 15, you took your perpetrator to court. That is quite remarkable. You also must have had a support structure around you.
Yes,
that enabled you, yeah. Because, what was it in you that said, I'm not letting him get away with this?
I wasn't the first individual, allegedly. I was about the third or fourth girl in the church. And that made me angry. The way I was beaten, not being able to recognize myself when I came out of sedation. Had I died, they'd not have been able to open the coffin. So I had to deal with, and the police thought a train had ridden over my face. So it was all of that as a 15-year-old that I couldn't deal with. In fact, I buried a lot of it. I just tried. So I did the repression thing. So I buried, and I allude to that as the graveyard of my soul, because I didn't know what to do with it. So I couldn't tell. I just didn't know. And so I buried it. And so I repressed it, didn't express it. It led to internalized anger because it was there. And when I went into one of the symptoms of fully blown post-traumatic stress disorder 1 year later, was actually showing signs of depression. And that really is ultimately what anger does when you don't express it. I then started therapy 1 year later. So for 1 whole year, I buried myself in my school books. That was the degree to which I successfully repressed and became the most phenomenal, more conscientious student. I don't know how I did it, but it was my coping mechanism. It was deflection. But 1 year later, that was when the anger started to set in, although therapy then was not about the anger in as much as it was about my pain and just my brokenness, because I did not know whether I'd ever feel okay again. And I think for us to be able to tell our children in whichever context that it's okay to be angry, that it's okay to not be okay. And so pretty much in my 20s, when I started to articulate, studying psychology as a student then, that is when the anger really set in. When I could not get, well, from 15, I could not understand how someone violates another. And that why was that leaden question. Why did he, do to me?
And you're never going to get that answer.
And that becomes the first step to processing our anger.
So Lynn, as someone who has an understanding of psychology, if someone's watching the program and they're angry, what would you say to them? Are they allowed to sit with that anger? I remember when I was writing my own story, how when I went through various emotions, I actually sat in it. I literally let it wash over me. What would you say to someone who is angry? How do they process it?
I would say, before we even get to the processing, it would be to recognize that you actually are angry, and to own your anger, and to own the fact that you have every justifiable reason to be angry.
Because you said we mustn't see it as a negative emotion. But there is something negative about anger, because anger festers and anger is destructive. So we want to move out of that space as well at some point. So
I think a part of you was asking, is there a concept called healthy anger? And my response to that is the expression of anger is healthy. So, to get to a point of saying that this is why I'm angry, and I have every right to be angry, but there's a fundamental difference between sitting with it, owning it, being drenched in it, having it wash over you, feeling it, and living in it. And when we get to a point, Tracy, of living in the anger, that is when we would have fallen victim to an emotion that can be destructive if we over-attach ourselves to it. In my case, 23 years of non-expression, not, fully understanding and trying in my little way, but eventually leading to ultimate release, that actually manifested in chronic bladder, womb, and tube infection for 23 years, to a point that I became immune to oral antibiotics, and I had no idea that the two were linked. We believe that when we hold on to the anger, we actually getting back at the person who angered us.
So how do we let go?
How do we let go? The first thing would be to own it and to say, it's okay, I can be angry. And in the absence, you spoke earlier of access, non-access to therapy. we've got to find creative ways of expressing it, whether it is to write a letter to the perpetrator, whether it is to have an empty chair, if it's not a therapeutic session, but to have an empty chair in front of you and have it out with that. I once became ardent golf driver. I just drove golf balls, but each ball had a name. So it is for us to actually to channel that, because when we don't channel it, we're not letting it out. So it would definitely be to find ways of expressing it. There are 3 types of anger. There's passive-aggressive, there is the aggressive anger, and the most healthy form of anger is assertive anger. And when you said earlier that you were in this position, you were surviving gender-based violence and you didn't feel like you could express your anger. And very often when we are feeling diminished as a result of trauma, as a result of violence, we will not have the capacity to assert ourselves. So as women, I mean, you can't fight fire with fire. If you have been violated and you're being punched, you don't have that capacity to punch back. But assertive anger might not have even worked in that context. So assertive anger does not mean that I need to sit opposite you and reach a point of resolve with you. Assertive anger just means that I need to be open and honest and direct to myself first and foremost as to why I am feeling what I'm feeling, and to have that conversation with myself. And again, if the conversation never happens with the perpetrator or anyone who harms us, that can be formatted in a letter or a poem or in whichever way, whether it is art, whatever, but to have
an outlet.
To have an outlet. And then the further channeling is obviously my physical exercise has always been my sanity as well.
Yeah, so take to the road, run it
take
out.
to the road,
Yes, run that marathon, live
go
your
and
dream.
find a space on the beach if you need to scream.
Yeah.
But go and do what
Something.
you need to do for you. Go and do something. And then the other thing is you have to also change your perspective as to how you look at this thing. Because if you are going to live in anger, you are living with the mindset of a victim. So you've got to ask yourself, how possibly for me not to become victim of the anger as well? I've already been victim of perpetration, of all of that. So what can I take from this? And when I became grateful, for example, that yes, it happened at 15, but I didn't die. I was living. It neutralized my judgment of the event. And sometimes we tend to judge the event, and obviously we can justifiably judge the person and the perpetrator. But we've got to find ways of neutralizing that judgment, of making what happens to us happen for humanity. In my case, it was to find the meaning in it.
Oh, Lynn, thank you. That is, I think we all just want to find meaning and purpose and understanding. Thank you for your insight. And if I can just give you a little token of appreciation for your time today, this is our T-shirt painted by Picasso, the painting pig.
Wow.
The logo that she painted for us called Unchained. Thank you for joining us. And
absolute pleasure. Thank you for my T-shirt.
Well, that's our episode of Am I Allowed to Be Angry? Join us next time here on Beyond Our Voices. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.